much. Didn't have to call them. Before I start the panel, hello everybody. My name is Gosia Brzezinska. I'm the founder of Communications Advisory. It's an honor to be here among such amazing change makers, change narrative makers, and people who are really passionate about the future of African storytelling. Today's panel on the future of the news agenda will really look at what is driving the news on Africa and why so many stereotypes are still visible in the news and the reporting. We, of course, have the era of influencing and Instagrams and TikToks, but people are still getting a lot of news and opinions from our journalists and main media outlets. So we'll be exploring why those stereotypes are still so visible in journalism and daily reporting. We'll also be talking about some of the solutions that can be implemented across media outlets, and we'll be thinking about what can be done to improve that. But before we do that, I encourage everyone to tweet about our conversations. Please use hashtag #AsWeAre as you report back on the conversations to the online world. Now, onto my amazing panelists. Please let me welcome Paula Frey, founder of Frey College, a college which is delivering change, which is training journalists on the future of change narratives for media. Welcome, Paula. Welcome, Lydia Nambiru, a news editor at The Continent, a media outlet which is trying to do things differently. And we'll be exploring what is The Continent doing differently when it comes to news reporting. We also have Alphonse Shindu, country editor of Africa Check, the first news fact-checking organization in Africa. Really keen to know what data is doing for our news reporting. And finally, welcome Otula Obor, who is the founding editor of Science Africa and a big advocate for more science for African reporting. Welcome, everybody. Alphonse, I would love to start with you. You are a huge advocate of more science when it comes to reporting on African news, more science journalism in general. What do you think is missing in journalism at the moment, and why science is so important when it comes to reporting and driving news?
Well, thank you very much. I think science for Africa is key in the sense that when we train young people from university, we always tell them that Africa is what it is because we have not put enough emphasis on science and technology, which simply means having technology to grow enough food, store it, having enough technology to build good houses, or if we have it, we don't use it. And we also give them comparisons. We tell them Russia is a superpower because of the technology, they can make weapons. The same with the US, they can beat you up. It's technology. Saudi Arabia can have a lot of oil, it cannot compete Japan with oil. They could easily go back to the desert. Somebody talked of having imported used clothes or something like that. We are doing that because we have policies which left that. When I was young, we never had these used clothes, but it became a business to help the poor. Then suddenly they flooded them. I buy them, so I'm not biased. So, without science and technology, we are living on imported modernity. And the world is getting small because, particularly with climate change. I used to cover UNEP, which is climate change. And the debate in those days was we were against these technologically advanced nations that we say they're polluting the planet, they've done 1, 2, 3. But that has changed very suddenly when forces of nature came in and you found things that make us look different. Now the humanity is getting to the same level. When there is drought in Italy, something they never imagined, it should be Somalia, or fish dying somewhere in Germany. These are the forces of nature trying to put humanity back to better use of science. And, Africa, unless we keep our promise of giving 1%, it is something I've started to hear before many of you were born. 1987, I don't know where you are, but African ministers met in Arusha, Dar es Salaam, and swore we'll give 1% of their budget to South Africa. South Africa tried, I don't know whether they reached 1%. But that is one big story which I can just talk.
That's really interesting, and it speaks very much to the hard news that can drive the opinions on the continent. But that's not necessarily what people want to click on. So moving on to Lydia, how do we ensure that the hard news, the important news that actually influence our day-to-day lives on the continent and beyond, are interesting to people? How do we present them differently? And I'm asking you that question because I know, it is your media outlet that introduces interesting articles such as what are the African leaders wearing today, and you do try and approach media and news differently while still maintaining that influence of the hard news.
So yes, how to get people to read the news? I don't think we know, even us know how you get people to read the news. I think part of the issue and why people are so unhappy with the news is what it is. I think news media should be like your alarm clock. You're supposed to get it. It's supposed to tell you to wake up when you want to go on sleeping. You're supposed to slap it and try to silence it. That's the function of news media. And I think a lot of what people see, like this is negative coverage. Yes, it is. That's why news media exists, and that's the function it plays in all of societies. All of journalists are driven by, most journalists anyway, are driven not so much, not by the same things, say, an artist is driven by. Artists love beauty. They love the sun. They write poems, even about suffering. They try to make beauty out of the worst things. I think journalists, we're scared it's going to get worse. So we're constantly pointing out where it's bad, hoping that something that telling you that this is bad, this is going wrong, this group is being excluded, this group is angry, this group is going to burn the city down, will stop things from getting worse. So I think, but it's not an easy thing to hear. It's not easy to wake up every day and see the same thing, the same terrible things. I think you see it even now when not journalists necessarily, but regular human beings are producing the news on social media. Eventually, you want to pull out of it, right? Because even when we do it, I'm a journalist, but even when you do it yourself, you're going to be most active on social media when something is wrong, right? The more popular social media sites aren't pictures where beautiful things are happening, even though that's really popular. There are Twitter where people are constantly sort of bringing them up. So that conflict makes trying to steal the news difficult to people. So our solution is to go back to the past, to go back a little bit to the past and produce a curated product. So we can tell you the hard news, that Darfur is on fire. You should keep paying attention to Sudan because people are dying. But also we can give you a review of a book, that's fun. We can take you to an art show that's happening in Nairobi, and hopefully that makes the news easier to come to. I think part of why we're so burnt out by the news is that curated product was broken, and now the news comes to you one story at a time. And like an earlier speaker was saying, it's the most negative things that go farthest. They're the ones that stick out the most and go farthest, which means unless you're a journalist like me, an editor like me, who's reading everything because you're being paid to read everything, the story that will get to you will be the most negative thing, which then makes it really interesting. So, but we're hoping that if we rebuild the newspaper, but distribute it, use technology as it exists now to distribute it as far as further than regular newspapers used to go. Use WhatsApp, use email, use Telegram, Signal to get it as far as possible, because that's the beauty of technology. But it's also reclaim it from the negative side of technology, which was to break the news into single stories and bombard people with the most negative things, that then will get people back to reading the news. So you get the hard stuff, but you also get to enjoy the culture of the place you're living. So that's what we're hoping will work, but we don't know for sure if it will work. The continent is just a few years old, maybe 3. Yeah.
Really interesting, because what you're saying is one solution to driving the news agenda and what are people reading is to get into every place possible where they can get that news. So whether that's your mobile, whether that's desktop computer or a print, you try and be there. And then relating very much to what Adam was saying on the previous panel is introducing new articles, new ways of thinking, and not necessarily trying to change the narrative that is in there, but introducing a new story and telling stories differently. We know that a lot of journalism is driven by data and relies on data information. Alphonse, can you tell us a little bit about your work with Africa Check and perhaps tell us how many times did you find out that reporting wasn't really done based on real facts that we can trust, that shape our opinions on the issues that affect our daily lives?
Thank you very much. And I was surprised when we were invited as Africa Check. And the reason is we are the people who let the facts get in the way of a good story. So we are not really third parties. But I am here and I'm really excited to mingle with these people, because you are speaking the language that we've been struggling to speak for the last 10 years. And it's very simple. What we are trying to do is to keep the public better understand. So that means we listen to what our public figures are saying, and then we try to break it down and say whether what they are saying is true or not. We're not trying to catch them lying. We're just trying to say whatever they are saying is it based on evidence. What we have seen, and this is coming to your question, is that for a long time, it has been taken for granted in Africa or in African countries, but I do not consider it as one country. So in many African countries, it's been taken for granted that if a public figure or a public official, whether it's the president or minister or whoever speaks, then the legitimacy of their office grants them automatic credibility. And this is the example. If they tell you the economy has grown by this number of people, then it's taken as automatic that it is true. When we sit down and we vet these things, we find that some of those numbers are not on the money. There are instances also where you find that our public figures read Western newspapers, they watch CNN, and then they come and repeat whatever they have seen on those international platforms to us as if it is factual. So it's really problematic. And for those in Kenya who've been following the news, you might have seen a minister who's quoting the Financial Times, and it's a prediction about the rise of oil prices following the Israel-Gaza thing. And then he comes and says that will almost like increase the prices of fuel in Kenya. And it brings about anxiety in the public, but it's a prediction about the future. Now, there are people who are also telling good stories about Africa. And some of them are officials. And this is the example I want to illustrate about how we get facts. We let facts get in the way of a good story. We have the US ambassador. Since the beginning, US ambassador in Kenya, since the beginning of the year, she's been giving a presentation which is titled, Why Africa, Why Kenya? So it's about just showing the opportunity available for Kenya. Now, the first time she made the presentation to a group of American businessmen, we saw it and we were like, okay, those numbers must be on the money. Then we saw a commentator in South Africa picked the presentation and did a commentary, and another commentator in the US picked data from her presentation and did a commentary that was published by Bloomberg and the Washington Post. Some of you might have seen it, about why Kenya is the next Singapore for Africa. And then these things are published overseas, and they are taken by public officials in Kenya. They come and put it on our faces to tell us that, look what they are saying about Kenya, we are doing well. But I think it's Natasha who mentioned about the official story not reflecting the lived realities of what we do. And so we sat down and we started checking the numbers. So one of the numbers was that the US is the biggest trading partner for Kenya, like the biggest export destination for Kenya, past Uganda. We trade more than Uganda, so we found that to be wrong, and we said as much. The other thing was when she says that Kenya is a renewable, Kenya's renewable electricity is over 90%. And we checked that, and we found that it was exaggerated, it was incorrect. So when we look at those numbers, and you see when she's speaking, she's not speaking to the Kenyan public, she's speaking to policy makers, she's meeting our governors and speaking in those platforms. So these numbers are influencing how they think, they're influencing policy. And that is why fact-checking comes in. She's telling a good story about Kenya, a good story about Africa. We're coming in and we're saying, it's a good story, thank you, but here are the statistics. Here are the correct figures, please use them. We want the good story to be based on the reality of the people so that we are not exaggerating. And that is why I think we exist. And the work that we do, we just try to keep the public debate honest. Think of us as janitors of public conversations. So we try to just clean it up and make it decent. Thank you.
Thank you. I was really happy you're here because we all need a little bit of fact checking. So I'll be checking my facts with you after the panel. We've all seen that story of Kenya being the next Singapore. I know a lot of friends and colleagues, especially here in Nairobi, were really excited about that article. But it's interesting to know the backstory of that as well. So what I'm hearing is that we need a lot more data reporting to inform us, so that we know exactly what's happening in the world of science, which these days really influences our lives. We need to report on that in new ways, in interesting ways. We need to get to the phones and people directly. The content is doing that, but we need to do it with fact checking as well. And that brings me to solutions, and the solution is the future journalist. And Paula, your organization trains journalists, specifically focusing on how they frame narratives, how they look at stories. What do you see in terms of trends of what the next generation of journalists are hoping for, and how can they tap into those three things we've discussed today?
Thanks very much, Fazia. So I wanted to start off by saying, that media is in a crisis. And generally speaking, we're in a crisis in terms of sustainability. For many different reasons. I think we're trying to find new business models. We're trying to find new ways of telling our stories. And I want to take a moment here to ask you, how many of you went to a legacy news source this morning, radio, television, a newspaper, to get your news, and how many of you got it from social media? So just think about that as a starting point. And then the second
Paula, let's use it as an opportunity to ask that question. Who was lazy this morning trying to get up to speed on
radio, TV, newspaper?
Hand up.
Thank you.
Guilty.
The journalist in me thanks you. How many of you got it from social media? Now here's the important question. How many of you avoided the news this morning and didn't read any news? Yeah? And therein lies our challenge. Therein lies our challenge. And in this crisis, though, it's both a crisis and it's an opportunity for us. It's an opportunity for us to rethink what we mean when we say news and putting Africa on the news agenda and how we define news. Because, I mean, The Continent is one of my favorite publications precisely because it sees us as more than just elections, politics, corruption, crisis, business news that comes from outside of the continent. When we did research for Africa No Filter, I mean, more than 80% of the news that Africa covers about Africa is hard news, breaking news. So you can imagine, we just see ourselves in elections, in politics, in he said, she said journalism, which doesn't really tell our fundamental story, but just kind of recounts people's words without actually asking the question, so what? So what does it mean? And so that is the starting point. We need to rethink what we mean by the word news and how we define the African story when it comes to news. Because the story of African fashion is news, right? The story of transformation, the people in this room, the work that people in this room is doing is also news. And we define news instead by what the big man says. Right? And by the big man, I literally mean male politicians across the continent. If you look at who's in our newspapers, that's who we have. So when you ask us, the kind of training that we're looking at, I mean, the starting point is really to rethink the way we tell stories. All of us, and most journalism, if we come from a British-based kind of journalism framework, we've been taught the inverted pyramid, the 5 W's and the H. And the 5 W's and the H, privileges, urban stories, because it's easy to get. You can do the 5 W's, you can do the who, what, where, when, why, and how really quickly. You can get it today. It privileges statements and press releases because there is somebody said something. It does not tell the story of trends, of development, of issues across the continent. And if we want to tell the story better in the continent, then we need to rethink that. The second thing I really want to focus on is the opportunity is that we need to stop trying to fix legacy media and need to think, where is the new? Where is the new space for news? Because breaking news is digital, it breaks on your phone. So how are we going to tell these stories that we need to tell about science? Because we can't try to keep on fitting what is quite clearly a square box into the round hole that is media at the moment.
Dr. Lane, have something to add?
Yes, I think she has raised an issue which is very important for this country, in that media is evolving like every other profession. And now the trend is towards solution. At South Africa, for the last 5 years, we have had interns, and they're going there. And then we have links with some universities. Here in Kenya, we have 3. Rwanda is 1, and in Uganda, we have Makerere, where the lecturers are starting to introduce solution journalism to the media, so that they don't come out saying, they have old days when they say, when it leads, it bleeds. 100 died today, another 100 more, another 1,000. That's the headline. Is something being done somewhere, not necessarily in your country. So solution journalism is evolving very fast in that the little people do, you have to follow certain protocols. Is there a problem? Is it being solved even if it is 1%? Is somebody else doing it somewhere? So it is not another 100 died. So it is becoming, it has to adapt, or else people are tired of the negative news and nothing is being done about it.
Yes, thank you. It's really interesting because we now will have a wave of journalists who are trained, who are ready to tell those stories. We have some media outlets which are focusing on changing that news agenda. But I'm really interested to know, what do you think one solution is to shaping the news agenda for the future of the continent and influencing perhaps those Western outlets, which often, as you say, influence the media here. So we'll be asking you for a solution. Keep in mind that in one of the reports from the Africa No Filter, editors from news outlets have said that their main issue to increase reporting and change their reporting on Africa is funding and ability to create strong teams that can focus on that. So back to my question, and I'll come back to you, Lydia. We'll start with you. If there's one solution that you would like to see the news and the media outlets implementing, not only within the outlet that you're with, but other journalists, what can be done to change that news agenda, to drive different type of news for Africa?
Just one.
Just one. We've got 4 minutes, so minute for each panelist.
Within newsrooms, I think we need to divest from big men, and big men being the primary way we see ourselves. Because I think, like often said, very often big men are not even speaking to us, right? If you think about our countries as post-colonies, and the big men are the chamber managers, they're still serving. Their overlords are people abroad. Very often, even though they're facing us and speaking to us, they're really marketing and branding the country for some capitalist in the US, some donor agency that's, and I think that makes us misunderstand ourselves. So I guess in the newsroom, I'd say bring more regular Africans outside of political spheres, outside of political post races into the news. Like, speak to those people, have them drive the news agenda as much as possible, such that when Nairobi is announced as the next Singapore, it's not a surprise to Nairobians, because Nairobians, that view hopefully came from Nairobians themselves. So it's
diversity in reporting on news is one of the solutions. Alphonse, what's your answer to that?
So I'll say more collaboration. Africa Check is in 4 countries. It's in Nigeria, it's in Senegal, it is in Kenya, and it's in South Africa. In all those countries, we collaborate with artists, we've collaborated with cartoonists. Our whole story is to tell, facts are boring, number one. So to make them interesting, we have to collaborate with creatives. And that's why, this is a very good place for me to show. So collaboration, it's a big deal for us, and I think working together, that would be a good place to start. And yes, we also need money. So thank you very much. We appreciate your support.
Make sure you have your checks ready. Okay, I'm loving this. Diversity in a new ways of storytelling, visual, creative ways. So our amazing change makers, you will be able to help and drive that. Paula, what's your answer? What's your one solution?
And so I would say that the value of Africa Check, the African Filters research, is that it provides evidence. And I think when we were doing focus group with editors, a lot of editors thought that they were in fact covering Africa. And when we brought the evidence to show that they weren't covering Africa, and they certainly were covering it in a very skewed way, it gives them the data to be able to change. So I think the one thing that we really need in newsrooms is evidence-based policies to rethink the way they tell the African stories, and linked to that would be for them really to then begin to think, how do we decolonize our coverage?
Okay, so we've got some holding journalists accountable and making sure that they know what they should be applying themselves to. And I love the fact that you're thinking, how do we decolonize the language? How do we make them think differently and with new resources? All right, and finally, Otula, what's your one solution? Can I ask you to use the mic?
I think where we're going, there may be a level playing field in terms that information is available almost at fingertips. But the biggest problem we are facing, particularly in the field of science, I had to deal with a lot of stereotypes from days of AIDS, where Africans were dying, there'll be plenty of parking space, okay, all those kind of things. And who did what. Then that went even to Ebola. Some book was written how people die from Mombasa to Congo. So all these stereotypes are there. not necessarily from the media. But right now it is very easy to correct some of those things. But again, with the era of artificial intelligence, we are told some things are made with information that were racially biased. So if you get one for medicine, you will find if you are black, you are being diagnosed. So the media has really to be on its toes to follow some of these things which may not be intentional, but it could be something coming back 100 years back until we also have, at the same time, it's not an excuse for us not to correct some of the things we don't do right, particularly in the field of science as the driving force for socio-economic development.
Wonderful. So we've heard it all. So we've got diversity, diversity of reporting, really important. Following innovation, making sure that the news actually tells us what is the latest solution to our problems. Policies and training, making sure that we invest in that. And finally, creativity. So creativity and facts are the main themes which align so well with today's summit, and I hope that all of you can help us implement it and influence the news agenda. Thank you to my wonderful panelists.